Yeah, I do think it is.
Okay, hang on just a second, Jimmy.
You there?
Yeah, I didn't hit record.
Oh, classy. If I was more charismatic, I'd say that means the Lord's up to something.
He has wiped out by his grace through faith in Christ your every sin, past, present, future.
Christian hedonist is somebody who says that my greatest joy, my greatest good is God. And therefore, I will pursue that joy and I will pursue that God above all else. So God's glorified and I'm satisfied.
You are now listening to the Pastor Discussions Podcast.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode number 40 of the Pastor Discussions Podcast. I'm John, and this is your weekly conversation on doctrine, faith, and the Christian life. And that's normally Joe's line. But because I've been watching my kids this week and my wife has been out of town, we have not been able to sit down and record together. So I know we promised you guys that we would interact with Al Mohler's thoughts on the social justice issues and the statement on social justice. But sorry, guys, we just haven't had time to sit down and talk through that. So what we decided to do was this week we have actually really cool show this week. We're joined by Jimmy Needham, which if you're not familiar with Jimmy Needham, we'll post some links to some stuff that he's done in the show notes. But Jimmy is awesome, and we really enjoyed having a conversation with him about creativity and Christianity and how we should think about creativity as Christians. And so we're going to play that for you this week. And then next week on episode 41, we will get back into what we had planned on doing this week, which was interacting with Al Mohler's comments from the SBTS Chapel. So sorry about that, but hopefully you'll forgive us because this is going to be a great podcast episode that we've been actually really looking forward to dropping, but haven't been able to yet. So on that note, a couple of things. Go check out pastordiscussions.com/gear. You can get some shirts and hats and stuff like that, and support the show. Help us to offset some of the costs of doing this. And then also we are part of the Bar Podcast Network. And so you can go to thebarpodcast.com and there's awesome content for your ear holes there. A lot of really good shows that are being put out. And Dwayne from the Bar Podcast has hinted that October is going to have some pretty awesome guests. So be sure to go over there and check that out. And one last thing, go to resurrectioncoffeeco.com and get some Resurrection Coffee Company coffee. We love this stuff. Dave is awesome, and he's doing some great work there in Chicago as a church planter, and Resurrection Coffee Company is a way that he helps support his family as he is doing the Lord's work in planting a church in the Avondale, Chicago area. So go check that out. The coffee is excellent. You will not be disappointed. It has ruined all of their coffee for me. So without further ado, let's get into it. We're going to sit down with Jimmy Needham and talk about creativity and the Christian. All right. Well, we are here with the Jimmy Needham. If you're not familiar with Jimmy, you need to be. He's got some awesome music and some great teaching and spoken word stuff. And so we're thankful to be able to have you on the show, Jimmy. Thanks for being here and chatting with us for a little bit.
Yeah, guys, my pleasure. Glad to chat with you too.
So let's sort of jump right into it and let's talk a little bit about creativity. And is creativity something that should be used by us to glorify God? Yes or no? If so, how and why?
Yeah, good question. I think the short answer, of course, is yes. It is. I think it's one of the ways to talk about what it means to be made in God's image. There's a lot of ways you could talk about that and what it means, but I think it's one of the things among many that it means to be made in the image of God. That we are creators in a way like our Heavenly Father's a creator, and so I think that it only makes sense that folks made in the image of the Creator create. And And we know that all things, our personhood and all of the things that come with being who we are meant to be leveraged to glorify God. So then the other answer is, yeah, of course. Our creativity, like every single other facility we might bring to the table, is meant to be exploited to make God famous. And so yes to that. When I think about creativity, especially like in the arts, I'm typically thinking in terms of how to freshly describe or convey ancient truths, and that's much of what I see my role as a songwriter, or anybody's role as a songwriter to be. It's to take those the age-old things and to bring them to bear on a new cultural context and a new historical moment without losing their substance. And that takes creativity, And so, or I say it a lot, like my sort of self, mantra when that drives me is I'm laboring to make the gospel rhyme, which for me is a shorthand way of talking about my process of creativity. So
that's awesome. So we've got a transcendent God where you can never fully describe him, and words will not ever adequately convey who he is and his greatness and his majesty and all of the excellencies of who he is. And so when you said we find new ways to express ancient truths, really what we're doing is we're doing something that will never end in eternity, because there's always going to be fresh expressions of God's glory and his personhood and who he is and his majesty. So it's never fully said, in other words.
Yeah, you're not going to plumb the depths of any attributes, you're going to, I think eternity is just going to feel like, we're just scratching the surface. I mean, it wouldn't be eternity if it didn't, like that. And which makes for a lot of really great fodder on this side of eternity, because it's like, well, if I'm not going to plumb eternally of all he is, and there's going to be more sides of the diamond to turn around and marvel at and help people see and express to people, and that's eternity, then now, where we see is through a mirror dimly, gosh, how much more confidence do I have that I'm not going to hit a brick wall of, I've run out of things to say about the Lord. You're just not, you're not going to come to that wall. And that's actually an encouragement, because it's like, well, there's a lot of material to work with here. So yeah,
that's good.
So how do you help people overcome some of the issues in, especially maybe in specific cultures, of taking some of those ancient truths, or maybe some of those traditions that are highly valued and are good, but need to be refreshened and redone in a new context, and in a maybe I don't want to say style, but just in a modern way where you still have what's good there, and you still have you're still valuing that, but you want to export it from one generation to another generation and help them, help that continue to be valued and continue on. Like, how do you, things that are legacies that the church has, or a church has, that it values, that are good things to value because they show us a truth, and they, I mean, especially we're talking, if we're going to talk about music tends to bring up a thought or a memory or a feeling. And so you don't want to lose some of those things that if those things help us work our eyes and our affections back towards God, and they help renew that, we want that to continue to happen, but we also want to keep that fresh. So how do you walk that line and help people understand that that's what you're trying to do? You're not trying to discredit what was, but you're trying to enhance it and make it valuable now, and make it valuable for the next generation and the next.
Yeah. a couple things come to my mind. One of the first things is to, I think to be freed up to do that kind of thing, you have to begin with the foundation of there's very little in terms of artistic expression that we should feel like our, I want to be careful here. There's less than we think when it comes to artistic expression that we should consider to be close-handed issues. I find that one of the things that stifles us in the church when it comes to progressing in the arts in our attempt to glorify God with the arts is that sort of mentality that happens with everybody. Of like, this thing that we did that one time is the way. It is the ordained, like sacred, canonized way to express and communicate about God. And if you move outside of that, you're actually moving outside of orthodoxy. And I think we just got to be careful there. I've heard some really wonderful Bible teachers who I would take to the bank with virtually anything that they teach about the word really mishandle this moment, because they sanctify, 16th century hymns as somehow the crown jewel of artistic expression. And it's like, man, that just feels crazy to me. I love those songs, but let's be clear. Like those songs were progressive back then.
Yeah.
And what we feel now is like that's what church music is, and I'm obviously speaking of a particular camp. Every camp is going to have their own sort of niche issue, but in this sort of maybe a more conservative camp likes to sanctify that as being special. It's like, man, they were towing the line. I mean, they were pushing the musical envelope of things that weren't being done at the time. And it's just helpful, I think, to remember that, because that, if you can come with a open-handedness, man, that really frees you up to like try some things, and I think one of the other things it does is it allows you to not be sort of cultural centric, ethnocentric in your worship too, because if you ordain one style or one thing as being like the only real meaningful way to creatively express worship to God, then you've just written off a lot of cultures.
Yeah.
And, I even think about like sort of like the African-American sort of canon of worship content, songs. You're not going to hear much coming from them, in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, because they were enslaved, like, and so you're writing off like swaths of people by ordaining one thing. So I think if we can get free from that, we open ourselves up to different cultural expressions and their creative sort of palettes, and then it allows us to create something fresh too. And the one other thing I'd say is I think that we have a worship residency that we do at my church, and part of it is like a songwriting sort of lane that we have our folks run in, and we're really big on you can't really create meaningfully or do like convey fresh what is ancient until you really know the ancient.
Yeah.
So like I'd say more than half of what we do for our worship residents and our songwriting residents is just theology.
Mm-hmm.
We're not even going to write a thing until we know what the heck we're talking about, and man, I think actually the irony is a lot of folks who are running in creative lanes, unfortunately, and this isn't everybody, but there's a big group that maybe just aren't seriously, or think seriously, like sound doctrine, deep scriptural, diet sort of thing. And I actually think that that's what unlocks the most profound creativity.
So it would be like theologically informed creativity then.
Yeah. And I feel like the deeper you go, the more you have to work with, you know?
Yeah.
Jen Wilkin says the heart can't love what the mind doesn't know, you know? And I think that that's true for creatives too. Like the songwriter can't write what the mind doesn't know, you know? And so I feel like the more you know, the broader your color choice is, you know, when you're painting, you know, and so
you basically then the issue that you just addressed, Joe's question, really actually comes back to the whole issue of being created in God's image, and God is a creative God, and there is no end to the expressions that we can form of who God is and what he has done. And so even in taking some of these ancient truths and freshening them up, we're kind of just building upon what other people have done in a way that presents them in a new light for a new generation to appreciate. So I sort of think about it in the same context of writers. So a lot of times writers are inspired. I mean, you got Jonathan Edwards, who most people wouldn't read. And then Piper can come in and synthesize and build on what Jonathan Edwards talks about. He's not discounting the old truths of Jonathan Edwards and the insights of Jonathan Edwards. He's freshening them up for a new generation to appreciate.
Absolutely. You know, I just think of, I mean, so much of how Jesus spoke in the Gospels was in parable, and he was leveraging events and situations and professions of the moment, you know, and it was in order to help his disciples see clearly a truth about God's kingdom, or about the nature of man, or about the judgment to come, or whatever it is, you know, and it's like, well, yeah, so we have a type of responsibility too, to leverage our cultural moments and you know, the things and the people and the professions and the all the goings on now to help convey similar truths. I mean, that's what any good sermon is, right? You're taking a point from Scripture, you're trying to make sense of it for your congregation, and then you're going to illustrate, right? And that illustration it's art, it's creativity. It's going, what thing could I lean on to help people see like the fullness of the beauty of this idea, you know? And so that's exactly what it is.
That's awesome.
So another question, because I think we've got two ditches here. So we've got people who are afraid of creativity and like what they know. And then you've got on the other side of that, you've got people who are just always throwing in the freshest thing, trying to maybe they're pushing the envelope all the time
without the theologically informed part.
Well, or even just beyond what people can handle. Sometimes as artists, we can tend to run ahead of people a lot and not judge. So what are some warning signs that you're starting to push too far, and you've gone from one ditch into the other ditch, and you need to be up on the road. So you're pushing people to dive into that artistic nature that we have as created beings, created after our God's image, with that creativity in us, but not pushing people to the point where it becomes not about pointing them to a creative God, but it becomes about, look what I can do in my creativity.
Yeah, that's a good question.
That is a great question. There's I guess a handful of thoughts that I have when you bring that up. And you know, I should preface this by saying, you know, I've done the singer-songwriter, making records, touring, you know, world of things, and then I've also done and am doing the local corporate worship, congregational thing week in, week out. And I think that I don't know how I would talk about it in terms of warning signs necessarily. Maybe it'll occur to me as I'm processing. One of the things I think is it's important to know what lane you're running in as you create, because that's going to determine in a very big way what your maybe creative choices are going to be. So, for instance, there's a ton of songs that that I have written that I would tour with and perform as sort of like a, hey, let me sing this over you, listen to this, think on this idea that's going to be something that I would never sing in church in a congregational context, because I have a different responsibility when I'm writing for, say, congregational worship than I do as a singer-songwriter who's a Christian. The agenda is the same. Set Jesus in front of people, help them treasure him, enjoy him, all those things. That the agenda is, but the task is different, because now in singer-songwriter Jimmy Ville, right? That guy, he can write things that maybe are deliberately more provocative imagery, not as on the nose themes that are probably going to take people a listen or two to grasp. But you would never want to do that congregationally, or at least really seldom, because you're hoping that by time two of playing the song, people get it, they understand the theme, they can latch on, and you're providing language for them to celebrate the truth that, say, they just heard in God's word being preached. And so the objective, the meta objective is the same: set Jesus before folks. I have some more creative license that I'm going to feel the freedom to take as an artist than as a worship leader. And so that's going to mitigate my ability to like get really artsy or lost in some imagery that's not as on the nose. And that kind of bums me out, by the way. It's like as a songwriter, as a creative, I'm like, I've actually never been able to really write the congregational stuff very well. Like if you listen to my catalog of songs, they're very much more contemplative, more like, think on this, you'll get it in a couple weeks sort of thing. But when I've sat down to write the Matt Redman-ish songs, I can't land the plane. I'm just not, that's not my bent. And I've learned that's just probably not a lane that I'm going to be able to run in very well. So I'll leave it to guys who can do that way better than me. But I think that does provide some, like, maybe some warning signs. If you're in a lane that is meant to help people quickly acclimate to a scriptural biblical truth, and it should be helping them to quickly engage with the theme and enjoy, celebrating God, and your writing doesn't match that. Your writing goes 2 or 3 steps too deep or profound. I think you actually are probably in a space you don't need to be in, which is kind of like, yeah, I feel like there's a lot of people that don't like that. And there's a lot of people who, I think naively would say, and that's what I don't like about, church music, is it's just so on the nose and it's like, well, yeah, but what's the other alternative? That it's not on the nose and everybody's all like scratching their head like through the worship set. So yeah, I don't know. It's a weird tension to live. Do you feel what I'm saying though?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like being able to discern the audience and the context that you're doing that creativity in.
Well, and then you want to provide clarity to the body you're leading. So like we've talked a lot about this, about when in picking songs or writing songs, is this a song that I'm going to have to explain what this means every time we sing it? Or is this something that is, and you were just talking about this, that's just going to be plain. It's right in front of you what it's saying. It's easy to grasp the concept, and then you're just learning the melody. And then also, I mean, one of the, I think goes along with that is the melody choices that we make as for guys who are in a leader of a corporate worship setting. Those are important too, because if you pick hard melodies that are aimed more at more of the singer-songwriter out touring, that in that lane, those are harder to sing for a body of people. Yeah. So there's lots of things there, and I think that's great advice. Like, is my personal bend towards the more artistic side, or is it more towards just being really rigid and congregational, and then trying to bring yourself to a place where you're centered and you're exegeting what you do, and it's meant for your body and the people that you're serving.
Totally. I think maybe one other thing that occurs to me as I'm sort of reflecting on, what distinguishes, or what should distinguish, like, the creative efforts for congregational singing versus like maybe the more performance art or contemplative stuff. I actually think that when I reflect on the songs that make up sort of like the church's song bank, whether that be in the hymn tradition or whatever, even like a lot of the CCM or even some of the gospel material, they're going to, when they do use metaphors, they're going to rely a lot heavier on metaphors that aren't transient, but they're timeless. Mm-hmm. So that's why I think we get a lot of the references to nature, for instance, sun, moon, and stars in their courses above, joined with all nature in manifold witness. You can sing that in 1550, or you can sing that in 1950. Yeah. You can sing that in 2050, because, you're going to get all of those elements, unless, some of these movies come true and there's no more trees. But you're likely going to get all of these elements for at least a little while longer. And so I do think that, like, and again, this is the critique that, like, even me and like my peers would often like cynically say about congregational music. It's like, oh, it's this always the same analogies, and it's like, yeah, sometimes it is, but it's not that there's no method to the madness. Yeah. I do think that we could do a better job as songwriters for the church to get more creative in our analogy, metaphor use. But I don't think it's wrong to regularly come back to metaphor, borrowing, using metaphors that are to be universal and not sort of transient, and like, that sort of thing. So I think that's probably another factor to consider.
Well, and there's another aspect to this creativity discussion, which most of the stuff that we're talking about involves language of some kind. So whether you're singing or preaching or writing or you're putting a play together, whatever, most creativity, with the exception of like wall art or whatever, requires wall art. Yeah, it is what it is, man.
Wall art.
Bob, whatever his name is on the PBC.
Bob Vila.
Yeah.
No, not Bob Vila.
No, not Bob Vila.
That's the
Bob Ross. Bob Ross. Yeah.
Bob Vila, though. Seriously.
Yeah, that's guy. He's on PBS. He was on PBS too for a while.
Well, there you go. So with the exception of like,
he's creative too. He built stuff.
Yeah, there you go. All right. So with the exception of like either construction or painting, most of the type of artistry or creativity that we're talking about involves language, which I think that there's two things that sort of I was thinking about as you were talking about that stuff, Jimmy. First one was the language has to be accessible, but then also there are also times when Paul makes up new words. There's times when creativity has to find new expressions for these things that we're saying, whether it's through hyphenation or like John Piper hyphenates almost everything, or whether it's through, coming up with a new way of expressing it. So there's like a tension there. There's like a balance where you want to use words that are accessible, but at the same time, there's a precision in language, especially if you're writing or doing something where you're taking a complex truth and distilling it, where you want to be accessible, yet you also want to be precise. And sometimes that requires creativity in and of itself and being able to accomplish those two things.
Being a theologian is really important there too, because every word means something. So you need to not just be particular, but you need to be accurate and careful in how you're putting something together. Because if you don't know truth, then you can wind up writing something that people latch onto that is leading them astray as well.
Yeah. So I could write things that rhyme that don't have any sort of theological bearing.
Like, that sounds really cool.
Oh, that's good. I like that. Let's sing that. And you know what I mean? So there's this creativity thing goes much deeper than just the end product that's produced. There's more that goes into that creativity or that creation, even in the selection of language that we use.
Yes, I agree. So I'm actually curious, your guys' take, and we don't have to chase this if you don't want, but I'm curious in light of those comments, where do you end up coming down on like that conversation? There's one that comes up every often, about a new worship hit, but like the reckless love song conversation, like when you hear that, do you feel like that moves into an unhelpful space, or do you have a grid like that making sense congregationally, that sort of thing? Because this is like a great example of like, okay, what, where do you come down on that? Because you're using language to convey something about God and you want it to be true, but you also want to find fresh ways to talk about these ancient truths.
Yeah. So like, I'll just speak for myself. Like I'm much more analytical than creative. And so for me, when I hear something like that, like I get hung up on the phrase reckless love. And I think of what does reckless mean? Is it reckless? Is there anything in scripture that would indicate that God's love is reckless? Reckless to me seems to be in opposition to I'm trying to think of the right word, intentional. Like I think there's an intentional love that God,
careful.
Yeah. Well, it seems to be in opposition to, like if somebody's reckless, you think that they just sort of haphazardly do stuff, and that's not how God's love functions. So I get stuck on that.
I get stuck on that too, but the reason I get stuck on it is because I understand what the artist is trying to do. That God overcomes and nothing will stop him from overcoming our sin and saving us. Now, there's a couple of things with this song. There's like the song is reformed, has a lot of reformed qualities to it, but then it's also confusing at the same time so can we sing that as a body together? My gut reaction to songs like that is no, because I think they're too light and gushy, and it's confusing because God's love is not reckless. It's exact. It does exactly. It's intentional. It's particular. It does exactly what it's meant to do. It's not like a wrecking ball that just comes in and smashes everybody down.
Oh, nice Miley Cyrus reference there.
Wow. Yeah. Another great worship leader. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So I was talking with another guy, a guy who I've spent a lot of time with, who leads worship, and he was asking me my opinion on this song. It's like, I read the lyrics of the song, and there's nothing about it that brings up red flags, super big red flags, but there's also things in it that I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to explain that. I'm going to have to explain that. I'm going to have to explain that. And as I run it through my grid, it's not a good song for us to sing as a church then.
Yeah. See, I would say if it was like overcoming love, but that doesn't pack the same punch, the same emotional punch as reckless love.
And that's the other thing is, okay, so is the artist trying to then, because of the language he picked, manipulate the singer or the hearer into feeling something outside of what is actually true.
And the last thing I'd say on that is okay, so Joe has really helped me with this, but music teaches.
Mm-hmm.
Music is an instrument of instruction. So the songs that we sing will build a theology within people, I think to a large degree, more impactfully and quickly brought to mind than our week in, week out preaching of the word, because there's the same number of songs, however many that may be, that you're sort of working through. They're familiar, they're known, they're memorized in certain cases, and they can be called upon for quick reflection, sort of like Bible memory verses, you know? So when we sing something as a congregation, we're teaching something. And my struggle with that is the implication of what we're teaching, because you don't have the advantage with singing of exposition and application that you have with preaching. So when we sing reckless love, and are we inadvertently giving people a theology of this 14-year-old type of love that just chases after whatever girl happens to find attractive at the moment and is just sort of like haphazardly throwing it out there? Or is this, or you know what I'm saying? Like, is that going to give people a wrong idea of God's love? Because there's already so many wrong ideas about God's love out there. We don't need to compound that with adding more to that. So we need more precision, I think, when it comes to God's love. And if the reality of God's love, his overcoming love or his intentional love or whatever word you want to use to describe it, doesn't awaken affections within us, then our affections are rooted in something other than God's true love. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. I appreciate getting to process that with you guys and hear your thoughts. And you know, I know that's
what are your thoughts on that song, Jimmy?
Yeah, I want to hear what you think about that.
So you know, it's interesting for me. So let me begin by saying I actually came down to say we will sing it congregationally as a church. So I made the decision at some point couple months ago, 3 months ago, to add it to our rotation. We're probably maybe once, I don't know, once a month, something like that. But I actually don't disagree in the main with anything you guys said per se. And you know, I know like Piper's article came out about it, and I think his point was like, there's 1,000 songs about God's love. Why not grab one of those that doesn't have any sort of ambiguity to it? Yeah. Which is not a bad point. You know, this is one of those tough moments where it's like, yeah, this is a wisdom issue more than it is like this verse says this and therefore you have to do it this way kind of issue. But for me, I felt like as I was sort of meditating on the idea of the punchline of the song, the reckless love of God, and then when I thought about how he was enforcing that idea, you know, and he's pulling on the shepherd leaving the 99 to go get the one, and the, you know, that whole, you know, analogy, the woman with the lost coin, that whole deal. That to me, there was something in Jesus's parable of those moments that does convey, like, as a listener hearing that parable maybe for the first time, that sort of shock of like, why would he do that? That seems crazy to me. And to me, the word reckless helped capture the felt response of somebody who is hearing for the first time, this God left heaven to come and rescue a bunch of people who hated him and died for them. And so when I think about like this syntax, like range of meaning of that word, I felt like there was enough in me, my opinion, enough sort of cultural understanding of like, there's another sort of way to think about that word that didn't strike me as like, well, that's just flat wrong or heresy, if we could in terms of that more felt definition than like he doesn't know what he's doing. But to be fair, I do think it does require maybe that extra step of like clarifying on the part of the worship leader.
I was going to ask, do you do that when you sing that song? Do you sort of help define that term in the way that you're thinking about it for the people?
I think I want to be accurate to what I actually do. I think the first times I did it, we had some, took a moment to sort of clarify, and not like in a weird way, but just to say like, this is what we mean when we say this. I haven't done it the past couple times, mostly because I feel like that's been established, but you're probably if you're doing a song like that, I do feel like you do have a responsibility as it comes. You're probably going to have to revisit that every once in a while. So I definitely feel the ownership of like, I am adding work to add it. Because I'm also adding some like.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think just for me personally, as the guy who leads us in worship and song here, I strive to not put anything in front of our people that has to be explained week in and week out. Like I don't know what it is, but I feel like
some of it might be contextual to where you're at too. Where are you at, Jimmy? Like what part of the country?
We're on the south side of Dallas.
Okay.
And
there's a totally different culture and context down there in the South than there is in Nebraska, rural Nebraska. So that's another thing to highlight probably, is some of those choices are probably reflecting the context and the specific congregation that you're shepherding.
Yeah, I think
there's definitely things like that going into it. Yeah,
I would agree. So I would just I don't know right or wrong. I think people need to be when we're singing, because it's not like, I think we talked about this, song and sermon have the same goals. They instruct and they teach and they work at the heart. But the sermon giver has a chance to explain his analogies and to point the people to what he's talking about. The worship leader does not always have that opportunity. Time doesn't allow him to. Structure doesn't allow him to. So as I put services together and I pick songs for our body, and like we said, it probably has a lot to do with the culture that you're in, but I strive for everything to be clear and as accurate, and because I don't think Reckless Love I don't think there's anything in the song that's inaccurate.
Yeah,
I just don't. Yeah. In my opinion, I think it's one of those songs where I thought it could have been written more clear to convey the same thing and have the same effect.
That's an interesting point, though. I'd never thought about it from a standpoint of like bringing that initial emotional response of hearing the parable of the lost sheep for the first time. Because we're all so familiar with it. It's we've had it 100 times. And so you kind of lose some of the
totally.
punch.
I mean, and that was to me the thing that allowed it to make sense. But you know what? I just want to say, like, I totally hear you, and I'm actually in some ways surprised that I came down where I did on this one. Pray for me, guys.
Well, but I think that goes towards those bends that we talked about, though. You're bent. You already admitted you're bent more towards that artistic singer-songwriter soloist side. My bend is far to the other side,
towards loving the Lord and caring for His people,
right? And shepherding and just not saying that you're not there, but those we understand that our bends are there. So
totally.
we get into a song that's controversial like that could go either way. It's not surprising that
those bends sort of come out.
And they kind of helped instruct how we come to the decision that we come to. So,
and also, I think it has the value of understanding why somebody else, like, because I hadn't thought about that that point
Yeah,
before.
it is a great. I had never either.
I think maybe we'll sort of end with this, like one of those things that you mentioned earlier was that bend, that singer-songwriter versus the congregational worship bend. I think in all of creativity, like you need those different creatives to help us think through things in different ways. Yeah. So that creativity is not just good for the masses; it's good for other people that are creative and leading in creative pursuits. I know that from a preaching standpoint. There are pastors that just illustrate things super well. We've gone to conferences, and Joe and I have sat down and talked about how it's just like a 10-second illustration that just it's like a blind Uber driver. I think it was Thabiti said something like that at a conference, and I was like, man, that was a perfect word pick. I wish I could do that. And so I need those types of things to help sharpen me. And so there's space for a lot of different creativity within the family of God, and we need to learn to not reject that, but to leverage that and benefit from one another.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I love that.
Hey, Jimmy, thank you so much. We appreciate you being on the show, man.
Man, so grateful. Thanks for the conversation. Really enlightening.
You bet.
Well, thanks a lot to Jimmy for being on the show, man. We really appreciate it. We enjoyed talking with you, and thank you for listening. We really appreciate you guys. When we started this, we had every intention of this just being a few people at church that listen, but we've been able to talk with all sorts of people from all over the country. And so thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, share it with your friends and invite them to listen, subscribe, rate us on iTunes. You can reach out to us at pastordiscussions@gmail.com and give us show ideas or comments. You can also comment on Facebook. You can like our Facebook page, or you can join our Facebook group and continue the discussion there. And we also have a phone number that's on our website. You can give us a call, leave us a voicemail. We'll play it on the air and answer your questions as best we can. So next week, we promise, we will be talking about Al Mohler's comments on social justice on the next episode of the Pastor Discussions podcast, your weekly conversation on doctrine, faith, and the Christian life.